Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's LGBTQ podcast and auditory queer cooling center for when it is just too damn hot out there, politically and literally. I'm Bryan Louder, an editor at Slate, and this week we're talking about bathroom bills. No, you didn't just glitch back to 2016. This is indeed 2024, and bills designed to police where trans people, and functionally all people, can pee are back in vogue, which is weird because remember how when North Carolina's HB2 was defeated with corporate boycotts and concert cancellations, we thought this particular legislative approach was dead? Well, it was, but then it wasn't. It's been easy to miss the reemergence of bathroom bills amid the recent wave of anti-trans and queer state legislation, but in fact, 12 of them have been passed into law in the last 15 months. And this time, there's almost no backlash to be seen. That's the subject of Nico Lang's latest piece for Slate. When Nico pitched me the idea, I admit I had no idea this was happening, so I was very happy to have them report out the situation and explain it for us. If you don't already know Nico, they're an award-winning reporter, editor, essayist, author, and critic. They've written for Slate, of course, Rolling Stone, Esquire, Teen Vogue, Them, The Advocate, Vice, Wall Street Journal, Out, and basically everywhere else you could possibly read anything online. And their Instagram, which I have recommended on the show before, is the indispensable Queer News Daily. And the cherry on top of all that great work is that their newest book, American Teenager, a chronicle of trans youth living their lives in 7 states across the U.S., will be out this October. We'll be back to talk bathroom bills with Nico after a short break.
Have you heard the term nuclear family? The phrase was coined by an anthropologist in the 1920s to describe the family structure of a straight married couple and their kids. Now, over a century later, only about 18% of Americans actually live in a family by that definition. That means that over 82% of Americans represent different kinds of family. From This Is Actually Happening comes The 82% Modern Stories of Love and Family, a special 6-part series focused on those who have broken away from the norm and challenged society's notions, from an asexual educator and activist raising a child with 2 other co-parents, to a gay man in the clergy who chose the path of celibacy and created a unique family unit with his straight best friend. Each episode offers an intimate first-person perspective from those whose family lives have taken different shapes. To listen to the 82% series, follow This Is Actually Happening on the Wondery app, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to This Is Actually Happening ad-free on Wondery Plus.
Female athletes have always needed grit and talent. But for decades, they've also needed a certificate
to prove that they were actually women, according to different definitions.
And even now, they're still being checked and questioned. Their story is the newest podcast series from CBC and NPR's Embedded. It's called Tested. Listen now.
Hi, I'm Josh Levine, one of the hosts of Slate's weekly sports show, Hang Up and Listen. Every Monday, I'm joined by Joel Anderson, who you might know from Slate's Slow Burn podcast, and Stefan Fatsis. This summer, we'll be diving into the Paris Olympics, watching Simone Biles, Sha'Carri Richardson, and Victor Wembanyama, obsessing over track, team handball, and breakdancing, and talking about the Olympic Committee's Russia ban and sex testing in elite sports. Check out Hang Up and Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, we're back. Nico, I'm so happy you could join us on the show today. Welcome to Outward.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, although always very slightly embarrassed when people read my bio.
I know. Yeah, we have to. Well, you should be proud of it. There's so many wonderful things there, especially the book, which I think we will sneak a little teaser in at the end of the conversation, if you don't mind. All right, well, let's start by going back to 2016. I mentioned North Carolina and HB2. Sort of set that scene for us. Remind us where the bathroom bill sort of as a concept came from and what maybe legislators at that time were trying to do with it.
Sure. If you don't mind, I think I'll actually approach this from a little bit of a personal perspective because like so much of my own history as a reporter is like tied to these bills because at the time that HB2 had passed, I'd very, very recently taken a job for The Advocate. I was their like West Coast reporter. I had only been reporting for a couple weeks before HB2 happened. And I think when all of that went down in North Carolina, I'm somewhat of a bad judge of what stories are going to be big. I just never know, right? Like always wrong. And I remember like telling my editor like that when the business backlash started happening, I was like, this isn't really going anywhere. Who cares about all these businesses? And it turned out people really cared. And it was a story for months and months. And to get a better sense of how it was affecting North Carolinians, particularly the trans community, I self-financed my own trip to North Carolina. I got on a bus because I was still scared of flying at the time. And I went to Charlotte to like talk to people who were affected by the law, to use the bathroom in North Carolina and like sit in the discomfort of and just like really be like on the ground, because I felt like I was seeing all these people report on it who didn't had been to North Carolina, who didn't have a relationship with it. And I just wanted it to be like informed by like a real knowledge of the community. And what was really wild is when I was there, HB 1523 in Mississippi passed. So I bought another bus ticket to go all the way to Mississippi. And it completely, for me, just like reframed who I was as like a journalist and as a reporter. I loved getting to do this story for you because in a way it was like a full circle moment. 8 years later, we still haven't really done that work, especially if all of bills are coming back and we're just completely ignoring it. But to actually answer your question the way you asked it.
No, that was great. Yeah.
Is in March 2016, the legislature in North Carolina forces through an anti-trans bathroom bill in one day based on a Charlotte non-discrimination ordinance, which had been passed, I believe, in February. And that the passage of that bathroom bill was the first of its kind in the entire country. And I think it really shocked people. We hadn't seen something like the Trump administration yet. And there was this idea that like bigotry was still this thing that was over the horizon and we didn't know what to do with it yet. And we knew it was out there, but like, who knows what form it might take. And here we're like very literally seeing the ways in which people can be institutionally discriminated against.
Right.
The business community had a problem with it. It was widely unpopular, like with the public.
And just to be clear for the listeners, explain exactly what the statute was.
So for those who aren't familiar, who have just like, I don't know, banished this to the recesses of their brain.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, bathroom bills don't just affect bathrooms. Like, of course they affect, you know, in the case of HB2, it affected restrooms in airports. If you were going to a restaurant, if you were going to a shopping mall, any form of like private or like public businesses, it affected that. But it also affected locker rooms. It also affected bathrooms in schools. It also affected not just like trans people, but it took away non-discrimination protections in public accommodation for lots of communities. Like I remember that one of the groups that was on the list, I believe for HB2, was veteran. So it's like, it was also like furthering discrimination against veterans, which I think people forget about, that it's not just like trans people who are affected by these things. It's lots and lots and lots of different groups. Like with a story I did earlier this year for the Daily Beast, when Florida passed its own anti-trans bathroom bill there last year, a lot of the people who have faced discrimination because of that aren't trans people, they're cis people.
I think it's always important to point out to people, if you haven't thought this through, that one of the biggest issues with these bills then and now is that there's really, and you say this in your piece, that there's really no way to enforce them, right? Unless the state installed bathroom monitors like at every door and locker room and whatever, there's no way to do it. So all it can really do is encourage vigilantism, right? It can only encourage people like other citizens, right, to sort of do this surveillance. So I'd like for you to just talk about the implications of that and how that looks like actually on the ground. And then I would also like to hear a little bit more about the boycott reaction at that time. But yeah, explain a little about just the mechanics of this, I guess, first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw this as early as HB2, that one of the stories that caught a lot of public attention was there was a lesbian chef in Charlotte who was walking down the street over the HB2 law. They called her some like homophobic slurs. They like pushed her on the ground and they kicked her. And, you know, she's a lesbian. She's not trans. But I think because perhaps, I don't remember like her appearance, but perhaps she was like a bit androgynous or even butch, because she like violates these like boundaries or lines of gender. These people who don't know that much about trans people saw her on the street and thought that she looked trans enough to be the object of their derision. Same thing happened in Florida, right? Where it's like people aren't attacking like trans people, they're attacking people who look trans. And that's a totally different thing because these laws, like there's just, as you say, no way to enforce them. So let's say that even if these laws were an Arizona style show me your papers law, right? Like that still wouldn't catch a lot of trans people because some trans people are able to update their birth certificates. They get access to like corrected social security cards, right? The Biden administration has made it easier to update your passport, right? So all these ways that trans people have access to updated documentation, which a lot of states are taking away. Like Florida, it was reported this week on the 19th, has started denying trans people correct birth certificates, not as a matter of like stated policy, but just saying that they don't have enough paperwork. Right. So you see like states that are rolling back access to paperwork to make things like bathrooms easier to police. But for the most part, like you just don't really know who's trans, like unless you ask people. And if people are thinking about their public safety, if you ask them if they're trans, even if they are trans, they might say no. Right. And then what do? Do you like pull their pants down?
Right.
It's just such an absurd
It goes
scenario.
to a crazy place really fast. I think that's just worth sort of pointing out at the beginning. To finish up our sort of time travel portion of the episode, you mentioned this already, but the business community really hated HB2. There were artists, concert cancellations, and things like that. Explain a little bit about how that boycott looked and why it was so strong and the effect it had, right? Because it was effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the time, the boycott looked like a lot of different things. You had companies like Deutsche Bank pulled a planned expansion out of the state. They were going to like inject like a certain number of jobs in the state. I think it was something like 200. And they said, no, we're not doing that anymore. We'll take our business somewhere else. And you had a lot of companies who all said that they were going to do the same thing. You had the NCAA said that they would pull championship games out of the state. Had Maroon 5 said that they were going to cancel a concert in the state, which honestly, for the better of North Carolina, nonetheless, still effective. Bruce Springsteen said he was no longer going to perform in the state. Cyndi Lauper. You had even Broadway productions, because you'll have, productions that perform on Broadway and then tour across the country. We had a number of composers and producers who said that their shows would no longer play in the state. And I think one of the reasons that really spoke to corporate America, I was thinking about this after writing the piece, because no one really talked about it, and I didn't want to conjecture, was that because the law affected private businesses, right? You have like a Denny's or something, like HB2 affected Denny's, right? You can't be trans and go to that bathroom that you want in a Denny's. But corporate America felt really violating, because they're like, you don't get to tell us how to run our business. But because of this wave of bathroom bills is about schools and it's about like government buildings, like those companies don't feel violated in the same way. So if they were to say, like, make a statement about this, it might seem to somebody who's like moderate on this issue or the Republican right as being some form of overreach, right? Which they've tried to say again and again, that like any form of support for LGBT folks among corporate America is like grooming or it's overreach or like all of these buzzwords that they tried to say to basically tell them to stay out of it. And it's proving more effective when you see like all these boycotts against companies like Target, like Tractor Supply recently had to like,
sure.
They won't work with LGBT people anymore. Like it's getting nuts. And I just think that the political landscape now is so different than it was in 2016.
In 2016, this did work, right? Because there had to be a compromise bill made that I think had sort of stopped non-discrimination ordinances in municipalities until 2020. Something completely different, but the bathroom bill was killed. And as you write in your piece, for a while, it seemed like the right was not going to try this anymore, that it had failed. When we come back from a short break, we're going to fast forward to now. And you've already mentioned this a little bit, but these bills are back in a different political landscape, as you say. And I think they're a little bit scarier now maybe than they were then. So let's take a quick break and we'll be back to talk about that. All right, we're back. Nico, you tell us in the piece that 12 of these bills have been passed in states in the last 15 months. Talk about that trend. Where did it start and sort of what's it look like now?
Yeah, they started in Arkansas, which was the first of this like modern wave of bathroom bills. I think essentially like a lot of states were just maybe waiting to see who would be the first. And then when that dam broke, you have all of these different laws in these different states that are being passed. Among the most dangerous of those laws, I would say, is probably Florida's, because it first in the history of the US of any bathroom bill to actually attach criminal penalties to its violation. So if memory serves, I believe it's 30 days in jail and a misdemeanor. So that separates it from the HB2, which we were talking about how difficult these laws are to enforce, didn't actually say how it was going to be enforced. Most of these bathroom bills don't, right? That you have the Utah law, which is among the modern wave of bathroom bills, right? Set up an office to take these complaints of trans people using the bathroom, right? So if you see a trans person using the bathroom, give us a call. We'll do something about it. They got something like over 10,000 reports of trans folks using the bathroom. Most of those are trolls, and the other ones were completely impossible to verify, right?
Right, of course.
Horrible systems where either trans people can be like criminalized for using the bathroom or they're being like surveilled in this horrible horrible, like unprovable way, creating this public hysteria for no reason. It's harmful, but it's also like invisible because no one's really talking about it.
Yeah. How are state legislatures, Republicans, sort of rebranding these from before? Because this is taking place in a different context, right? We're now in the sort of era of, I hate to say that, of like a larger assault on trans kids, right? The groomer rhetoric, stuff we've been talking about on the show constantly for a while now, book bans, that kind of thing. How are they sort of pitching this now? Because it's not, it used to be, right, that there was going to be some sketchy man in a dress, in quotes, right, that was going to be like attacking you in the bathroom. That was the fantasy, right? That was supposed to happen. And of course, that wasn't true. It wasn't based on any evidence and it didn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, let's like idea of like a phantom bathroom predator. It never really caught on with the public. Polls showed that again and again and again. And this time around when they tried it, I think they're still relying on this idea of like safety and privacy, right? You even see that like some of the bill language, which will refer to like the safety and privacy of women and children. But the thing is, that's not really often what they're leading with. What they're leading with is the idea of grooming and indoctrination. This concept that pro-LGBT laws or ordinances or policies are grooming children into being queer and to being trans. And if we don't do something about it by forcing trans kids to use the wrong bathroom, they might live their lives in a way that we don't like. And on what could happen to society if we do that. And that's pretty, in my mind, effectively piggybacked on this like parents' rights movement and these like don't say gay, don't say trans bills that have been now implemented in so many states that are doing the same thing. They're taking pro-LGBT resources out of schools. They're stripping away books. They're not letting teachers talk about LGBT community in class because they don't want to give kids like any show of support or validation or affirmation. And these laws, in many ways, the modern way of a bathroom bills is part of that same project of like, if you are a young trans person, they're just trying to make your life as hard as possible. And bathrooms are a really, really effective way to do that. Because if you can't go to a bathroom that like aligns with like your sense of self, it's really hard to go to school. Like you have it all day, you end up with UTIs. Let's say if it's like, a public bathroom bill or a government building bathroom bill, like that changes the way that you function in daily life. It changes like where you shop, where you eat, where you hang out. Like it means that you can't really be yourself or do the kinds of things you want to do. And that's what Republicans are after here. They're trying to make it more difficult to be a queer person in daily life.
Yeah, I was going to ask you next, what are the impacts we're seeing on the ground now in the states that have already done this? And you've just started talking about it. I mean, I think there's a person in your piece, one of your sources, who explains that really well, that it becomes impossible to sort of move about in daily life with this. But could you speak a little bit more about what we do know about the impact of these, maybe in Florida specifically or Utah?
Yeah, so in Florida, as I talked about before, there's been an increase in harassment in public spaces because of these bills, often targeting cisgender people, but also targeting trans people as well. Something similar is happening in Utah with what we talked about with the public surveillance of trans people who are being reported to this hotline if they use bathrooms that don't align with the sex they were assigned at birth. But something I really wanted to also talk about here is something I've heard so often from trans folks, whether it's in Utah, whether it's in Florida or other states that have been affected by these laws, that they're just scared to go outside anymore. That people don't leave their houses unless they absolutely have to. They don't hang out with friends. They invite people over their house if like they are like being social. People just kind of put their lives on pause because they're scared and they don't know what's going to happen next. There's been a lot of reporting about waves of trans people who've moved out of states like Florida just in fear of anti-LGBTQ plus discrimination because of the medical care bans that have passed, because of the sports bans that have been passed. But even more than that, like, not all these people can afford to leave. And if you can't leave, what do you do? Like, what do you do if you need to like go to a public space? What do you need to do if like you have to access these kinds of resources? Because honest truth is that the average person doesn't know what these bathroom bills actually do. So all it's really doing is emboldening people to be hateful. It's emboldening people to harass people or to attack them in bathrooms, not knowing that these laws actually don't apply to like gas station bathrooms, right? Or to the bathroom in a restaurant. One of the sources that I spoke to on an earlier story I did on this, they were just like seeing a musical, like a local musical, and they were harassed in the bathroom. And for me, I think that that's like what Republican lawmakers really wanted all along. Didn't want people to apply the law to like, the letter of the way it's written. They just wanted to make it harder to be trans. And I think they, in a lot of places, are doing that really effectively, like way too effectively.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that we've been sort of a theme, I guess, that we've been tracking on the show a couple of years now, which is the project of forcing trans and queer people out of public life, right? That's what you've been saying. Is this is a very effective way of doing that. If you can't use the bathroom, like it's very difficult to go. So it's not surprising to hear that people are staying home. That is the intent, I think, of at least to start with, of this kind of legislation. One thing that's different this time that you started to speak to a little bit earlier, but we should underline, is that this time around, we're not seeing those boycotts. We're not seeing the big sort of broad spectrum backlash that we saw with HB2. And you mentioned a few things already that sort of suggest why that might be. It depends on where the law applies. So if it's a private business, are they going to speak about public, like government building restrooms? That's one thing. The children parental rights thing also seems really relevant. It strikes me throughout all of this current wave of legislation that has been such an effective rhetorical mood or space for Republicans to work in, because it's just hard to argue with parents, right? They're this like sacrosanct kind of unit in our culture. It seems to me that might be part of why we're not seeing the boycott. Can you speak just a little bit to where is the backlash this time?
If I can, I don't know. I think if I can disagree a little bit, I think there's a greater thing that we need to get to here that I'm glad you circled back to, because I feel like I soft pedaled a little bit the responsibility of like corporations and major companies and all this. And I don't want people to think that this is something that I don't take seriously. I think the reason that I sound perhaps like a little bit cynical about this is that I've never believed that companies were going to save us to begin with, that corporate America was going to save us. I mentioned in brief HB 1523 earlier, the Mississippi law, and I think that's a really instructive example. So HB 1523, if you're not aware, it's possibly the worst anti-LGBT law that's been passed by any state in history, although there's a lot of competition now.
Right.
It allows businesses and public entities to deny service to LGBT folks on the basis of their identities, right? So if you like go to a restaurant, you may turn for like being queer. If you're shopping at like the grocery store, or, even like going to the doctor, right? There's been a lot of questions about how this would apply to services like education, like healthcare. Like, where does it stop? We don't really know. And courts have thus far declined to get involved. There was a case where someone tried to sue to overturn HB 1523. They said that there was no standing because they hadn't demonstrated how it would actually harm LGBT folks, that thus far the harm is hypothetical, right? So as of now, HB 1523 is still on the books. It's been on the books for like 8 years and no one really talks about it. And at the time, I wrote for Salon.com about my skepticism then that corporate backlash would save anything or like solve anything. And part of the reason that I wrote this was a little bit, or the piece for you, is that a little bit of a victory lap. And I don't, mean to brag about this, but I was totally right. It didn't. Because if you look at Mississippi, there are very companies who could pull their business from the state. Like, it's the poorest state in the country. Most of the industries there are things like hospitals. They're like prisons that aren't going to pull out of the state just because a law is passed they don't agree with. There aren't resources that we can pull from the state. And those resources that are there are really important. Like, people are already like, I get emotional when I talk about this because like I have a lot of friends who live there and this feels really personal for me. But it's like people are already struggling. Like, you can't pull resources from a state like that just doesn't have any, right? So the only states that we even get to talk about here are like extremely wealthy resource states. Like, you get to talk about like Texas, Florida, California. And if you look at Florida, like, businesses haven't even really gotten involved there this time around, right? So even in the states where you think that businesses could have some kind of sway, it just hasn't made a dent anymore because there are so many anti-LGBT laws, right? In 2016, when South Dakota passed its anti-trans bathroom bill through the legislature, it wasn't signed into law by the governor, Dennis Dugard, because of fear of how it would impact the state's tourism economy, right? That the state makes something like $1 billion or $1 trillion or $1 zillion. So Dennis Dugard could look at this and go, this isn't worth the risk to me. But now that so many states pass their own anti-trans bathroom bills, right? There's a strength in numbers, as Kate Oakley from the Human Rights Campaign told me in the piece that I wrote, that when you have all these states that sort of like band together to pass anti-trans legislation, they sort of say to themselves, well, you can't boycott all of us. Because it's like, oh, well, boycott like Florida, you're going to have to boycott Arkansas. You're going to have to boycott Tennessee. You're going to have to boycott all these other states that have done the exact same thing. And for corporate America, that's just not going to happen. I think even the most optimistic among us would go, no, like no company is really going to do that. Look at what happened with Target over the past couple of years. A little bit of criticism regarding their like Pride collection, and they pull it in half of stores across the country. They're like not going to like ride for us the way that we want them to. Because the thing is, they were never really riding for us. They were doing what they thought economically benefited them at the time in 2016. And now they're doing the same thing. They're doing what they feel economically benefits them. And that's all it was about.
You sort of end the piece on a certainly not a hopeful note, on a concerning note that this style of legislation is probably we're going to see more of it, that this is probably the future of anti-trans legislation for a while. Can you talk about why that is? You mentioned that, we may be kind of, I think the word you use is like maxed out almost on the healthcare stuff for the moment. Talk a little bit about why you see this being the sort of the next direction that Republican controlled legislatures pursue.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's about like everything you just said, which is that anti-trans medical care bills and sports bans have run out of steam. Like there are no more places that they can go. All of the states who were going to pass those kinds of laws pretty much already have, right? Like there are maybe a couple states that are waiting in the wings, but for the most part, like that's done. So they've got to find something else, because the thing with Republicans and attacking LGBTQ plus rights is that it's not just like one and done. Right. It's not, we got everything we wanted and we're going to stop here. Like, as we've seen, like with abortion, right? They never stop with abortion. They're not going to stop with LGBTQ plus rights. So what they're going to do is they're going to figure out, okay, what is the next thing that we can go after? And I think they've seen that with the limited backlash to these bathroom bans, right? That it's a real growth industry for them, right? That they can pass it in a bunch of states and people aren't going to really freak out about it. So of course they're going to do it then. Why wouldn't they? There's like very little like fallout for them. Whereas if you look at the drag bans, I haven't teased out what the difference is here, right? But the drag bans have generated like a kind of backlash
that's true.
for them. I haven't really seen with these like bathroom bans. And the drag bans have kind of stopped, right? We have like a handful of states that have passed them. It doesn't feel like other states are really like itching to do the same, especially because so many of those bills have been struck down in court, that essentially like every court except for like one in Texas that has had the ability to look at these like drag bans has said they're unconstitutional and we're going to strike it down, right? And it's happened again and again and again. With these bathrooms, the bathroom bans, that hasn't happened in the same way yet. It might. But because even like the legal system hasn't stepped in to stop it, like I feel like Republicans are just going to see how much they can get away with. They're going to see like how much the public can let them discriminate. And that's what activists have been saying about this for such a long time, is that Republicans are just going to keep trying again and again and again to see how much anti-trans discrimination they can get away with without facing any kind of like political backlash for it. And when it comes to these bathroom bills, apparently the sky's the limit, because you can pass 12 and nobody's going to really say a word. Like, not to toot my own horn, but it's like I'm one of the few like reporters who is even reporting on this right now, because it's not that I'm great and everyone else is terrible, but there's so much to cover, right? That like there are a ton of amazing trans reporters who are doing like incredible work, but they're all stretched thin, right?
Exhausted.
They can't cover everything. And because I think a lot of people feel like, oh, bathroom bills, that's something of the past. That was so like 2016. It makes it feel less imperative to cover, which means they can kind of get away with it because all of us who do this work are just spread so thin. So I hope that in telling these stories, it reminds people how important this is, because it's not just about it's not just about restrooms. It's not all about locker rooms. It's about people's ability to move through daily life. And if you take that away from them, there's not a lot else we have left.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from this conversation and from your really excellent piece that these bills are definitely not in the past. They very much are present and our future. Speaking of, if I can make maybe a slightly cheesy segue, but I think it's a nice one. Speaking of the future, your book is coming out in October. It's called American Teenager, and it's about trans kids. You actually went, the great subject of our time in LGBT media, but you actually went out and talked to a bunch of trans kids now who are living in this country and this sort of political climate. Could you give us like a little teaser of what this book's about? I don't know. Give us a little taste of what that book's all about and maybe how it connects to this subject, even if you want.
Sure. I think it absolutely does connect to the subject. So thank you. I spent the better part of a year traveling the country to spend time with 7 families of trans youth in 7 different states. I'm going to see if I can do them in order. I'm really bad at this. So it's South Dakota, then Alabama, then West Virginia, followed by Texas, then Illinois, then Florida, and then ending in California for selfish reasons because it is where I live. My goal with that is that as somebody who's been working with families of trans youth now for about 6 or 7 years, depending on how one counts, to tell their stories, often like trans kids just aren't at the liberty to be able to tell their stories themselves because either they're quite young, they're like 5 years old or 8 years old, and they can't really narrativize their own experience yet. Or, they're dealing with so much discrimination or just trying to be a kid and they can't really they're not in the place to speak about this right now. So you have a lot of instances in which the parents have to speak for their own kids. And obviously, I think that's just sort of part of the deal, right? And I completely understand why that has to be the way it is. But I think we lose something in that, right? We lose something in translation when trans kids aren't able to speak for themselves about their own experiences. And I wanted a book that would just be 300 pages of that, of hearing directly from trans kids about what it's like to be themselves, what their daily lives are like, and how all of these anti-trans and anti-LGBT bills have affected their ability to exist. And I think more than that, I just often find that, so for instance, when I was sort of talking about this book and pitching it around and I would mention it to friends and they'd be like, oh, so it's about trans joy, right? And I'd be like, yeah, kind of. But I often feel we get forced into these binaries where we can only talk about tragedy and joy, right? I wanted to remind people that queer people and trans people feel all the same things that they do. We feel the entire range of human emotions that they do. We have the range of human experiences that they do. And we rarely ever get to represent that, or talk about that, because we're often just responding to this news cycle, to this legislation that takes away our right to exist. So we sort of only get to exist in these kind of modes, right? We're angry, or we're frustrated, or we're defiant, or we're sad, or we're happy in spite of everything. I wanted these stories to feel just really complicated and unique and idiosyncratic. One of my favorites was the second to last chapter in Florida. I hung out with a trans girl and her non-binary sibling, who are these goth kids who are really into horror movies and Kierkegaard. Talked about Scandinavian philosophy for 2 weeks and hung out on the balcony where they smoke cigarettes. And it was just so not the kind of experience that I thought I would have going into this book. But to me, that was kind of exciting about it, right? That you could pick up a book like this and have no idea what you were going to get. But with each chapter, I wanted to build narrative complexity. I wanted to give people facets of this person's story that surprise them or sort of challenge their assumptions or just make them think about this issue in a way that they didn't expect to think about it going in. Maybe even people who have trans kids or who are on our side and believe that trans kids deserve dignity and safety and privacy the same way other people do. I wanted to maybe hear something they'd never heard before. I would hear from parents of trans youth as we were sort of sending this book out to readers to make sure that it wasn't horrible garbage, and how much they appreciated hearing from kids who didn't want to be activists, right? The trans youth that we hear from in the media, the ones who are allowed to speak, are these incredible young activists, right? But I wasn't that kid, I was messy, weird, strange kid that people did not know what to do with, right? And I loved making room for those kinds of kids who were more like me, who were still figuring it out, right? Or don't see, themselves in activism, but do see a role for themselves doing something else and leading a kind of that life that we hadn't heard about before. And I just love to give them that space. And I so much from parents now that they feel it's changed the way that they approach kids when they talk to them about doing advocacy, and stop assuming that everyone wants to be out there publicly sharing their story, because a lot of them just want to be kids. Pretty much every kid in this book, I feel at the end of the day, doesn't really want to do this and just wants to be a kid. For me, this plea was very much that Republicans have talked about letting kids be kids. Great, and leave them alone.
Yeah, let kids be kids. And I think, to bring it back to the topic of this particular show, let people pee, right? They're very simple statements, but that have, unfortunately, a lot of issues right now in our country. Nico, you are worth everything. This piece that you wrote for Slate is so wonderful. I want all of our listeners to go read it. It's called Anti-Trans Bathroom Bills Are Making a Major Comeback. Where's the outrage this time? You can just search that or Nico Lang and Slate and you'll find it. And also, if you do not follow Nico already on Instagram, Queer News Daily, it's essential. You really will find out everything you need to know about what's going on with bathroom bills and everything else by following Nico there. Nico, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for writing the piece. I think it's really important and I hope our listeners learn a lot from it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that is the show for this week. Please send us feedback, advice, questions, and topic ideas at outwardpodcast@slate.com. A reminder, as always, that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Working, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more about that, go to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show is produced by Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app. Tell your friends about it. Give us those 5-star reviews. We love them so much. That helps others find it and join in on the fun. Until next week, bye everyone, and stay gay.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, you know, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 18+. Terms and conditions apply.